I want to call your attention to Matthew chapter 5, verse 6, as we continue in our series, The Blessed Life. Matthew 5, verse 6 reads like this: Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. I want to talk about, with the Lord's help in your prayers, the benefits of a healthy appetite. The benefits of a healthy appetite. Church, is there anyone here that can recall the days of Grandma, Granny, and Big Mama? Listen, church, these are the days before GGs and G-Mamas and Sweet Mamas. Many of us here, we can recall those days where we were reared by the strong discipline and the tender love of a grandmother. One of my fond memories of my grandmothers is I can recall them talking to relatives and friends, and they will be talking about one of the great joys and delights that they had was seeing their grandchildren eating. And they would say stuff like this. I can recall them saying, I love or don't mind having a child that has a healthy appetite. Y'all had a grandmama like me. Grandmothers find great delight when their grandchildren eat a healthy amount of food. Listen, church, on a higher and holier level, God is not so much concerned with the largeness of our appetites, but God is more so concerned with the quality of our appetite. And there ought to be someone here that can testify that you are tired of business as usual. You ought to be tired of a status quo relationship with God. You ought to be tired of coming to church out of routine instead of out of sincere appreciation to God. You ought to be tired of going week in and week out with a loose connection to the Lord. Maybe you ought to want to embrace the words of the psalmist David when he says, as the deer panteth after the waters, so my soul longs for a living God. Let me say this, living God. Listen, when you pursue a living God, your relationship with God is not stationary. When you pursue a living God, you can't be satisfied with where you were last year in God. When you pursue a living God, you expect God to consequently leave you with a living testimony. Listen, church, this fourth beatitude: blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they will be filled. It calls each of us to examine our appetite. We've heard the age-old saying, you are what you eat. I think it's worth asking on a spiritual level, what have you been craving for and eating lately? Is your appetite to follow the voice within because you're too rebellious to the idea of any kind of authority over your life? Have you been eating at the table of self-directed spirituality? Now, because you have a little lettering behind your name and you become more educated and sophisticated, so you say, I take my spirituality in my own hands? Have you been eating in the drive-through of spirituality, where you come a Sunday here and a Sunday there and a Bible study here and a Bible study there? If you say amen, you won't look guilty. Or have you been surviving on a eat and run type of spirituality? You read a verse here and you take Facebook and Instagram as your church and you think that's your spiritual nourishment? Church, if we're not careful, we look like the people that Jeremiah prophesied to in Jeremiah 2:13 when he said, for my people have done two evil things, for they have abandoned me, they have forsaken the fountain of living water, and they dug for themselves cracked cisterns that cannot hold water at all. Lean in, church. Can I ask you a question? Have you been settling to drink water from a cracked cistern? Here Jesus calls his disciples then and us today to not just to a large appetite, but for a healthy appetite. Listen, spirituality should affect us holistically. God calls you and I into a relationship that's beyond the sanctuary and simply more than us knowing God by name, but we have to learn to embrace God's character. This is the take-home truth. God places a need in us that only pursuing after God that it can be satisfied. God places a need in us that only pursuing after God that it can be satisfied. This is the deed to do. Pursue God like a healthy lifestyle, knowing the end result is incredibly satisfying. Are you with me? Listen, I just want to walk through this text. I don't want to give any points today. I just want to walk through it and see what God has for us to learn. Listen to the text. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Are you with me? When God created us, God placed something in us that only Jesus can satisfy. There is a dissatisfaction within us. Listen, we should have a hunger and a thirst within us that earthly methods cannot satisfy. The hunger we possess, Cracker Barrel, U.S. Pizza, Tzatziki's, cannot satisfy. The thirst that you carry, Mountain Dew, Fiji water, mountain water, cannot quench. The text says, those that thirst after God. It paints a picture of an individual who is tired and exhausted and is parched. It leans toward antiquity when the people would travel and they would trek ahead. They didn't have any water. They didn't have any water bottles. They didn't have any water holes. They would load their beast of burden, and in between them and their next destination, they would battle thirst. They didn't have any water, so they had to wait until they got to their next drinking station until they were able to satisfy their thirst. Can I tell you something, church? Thirst, if you're not careful, can lead to dehydration, and dehydration can lead to death. That's why there are so many people who are walking dead. We have some people in the church who are the walking dead because life has a way of leaving you tired and thirsty. Who am I talking to that you can testify life has a way of stripping you? Your children have a way of leaving you tired and thirsty. The job has a way of leaving you tired and thirsty. Family can leave you tired and thirsty. And if you ain't careful, even church can leave you tired and thirsty. And you're in between your now and your not yet, and you're struggling with thirst. That's why you came to church this morning, because you struggling with thirst. You struggling to get a more closer walk with God. You came this morning for God to fill you up again. But the text goes further. It says those who are hungry. Let the church say hungry. This is not a light matter. This term offers us a picture of an individual who feels the intense pangs of hunger. This is not a minor pain. This is an intense feeling that's the result of almost near starvation. There's a longing inside of us that leaves you and I painfully dissatisfied. Have you ever wondered why? The relationships you go after are unrewarded. No matter how good the shopping is, the sale, or how expensive or exotic the gift is, you're still not content. The promotion that you worked so hard for is still haven't given you peace or a sense of self. The membership of the organization doesn't maintain your attention or your interest. Why? Because surface engagements cannot remedy matters of the soul. Only Jesus can touch your soul. And that's what I came to tell somebody here. Stop pursuing stuff, because there's some things that's a soul matter. But then there's also the disclosure within, the disclosure of our character. Listen, this is uncomfortable, church. Jesus calls each of us to examine what we crave. Remember, we are what we eat. Our appetite is always revealing. Thomas Guthrie said, if you find yourself loving any pleasure better than your prayers, any book more than your Bible, any house more than God's house, any table more than God's table, any person more than Christ, and any indulgence more than the hope of heaven, you ought to be alarmed. Listen, what we hunger for reveals the character of our souls. This calls for self-examination. And listen, I know sometimes what we crave, nobody else knows, but this is the word. You may fool some of the people some of the time, and you may fool most of the people most of the time, but you can't fool God. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, you can't fool God. So that's why you ought to ask God in the words of the psalmist that says, search me and know my heart and know my thoughts. Listen, church, you ought to ask God to do examination on you so you won't lead yourself into destruction. We used to sing an old song at the little church that I grew up in on the first Sunday before communion, a day like today. We used to sing this song, search me, Lord, search me, Lord. Not if you find, but when you find anything that shouldn't be, Lord, take it out. Lean in. Sometimes if God is going to do examination on you, sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it's intrusive, and sometimes it's embarrassing. But the fact of the matter is, it's always for your good. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, you ought to let God do an examination on you. Jesus says, blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness. We must possess a determination to desire Christ. Y'all doing a lot over here on this side. Christ above all other affections and delights. Notice this pursuit is not for those who already feel that they have secured righteousness. All lean in, church. This is not for those who think they have Christian seniority. This ain't for church people who feel like they are upperclassmen in the kingdom of God. This is what I came to tell somebody. There's no such thing as upperclassmen in God's kingdom. Just because you grew up in church, just because you have a title in front of your name doesn't mean that you have graduated or aced God. Just because we have gifts and talents and we are in the economy of leadership in God's kingdom doesn't mean that we have Christian seniority. We are all disciples and learners of Jesus Christ. This word, those who thirst after righteousness, this is not for people who think they've aced God. Came to tell you today, church attendance and knowledge of Christ does not automatically determine one desires Christ. I said again, church attendance and knowledge of Christ does not automatically determine we desire Christ. Listen, it's possible to come to church and not have an appetite for Christ. That's dangerous because Christ is the main entree. But too often us church folk, we settle for the appetizers and desserts of Christian worship and commitment. You don't believe me? See if I can push it. You know you're settling for the appetizer and dessert when you spend more time on worried about who's leading. That's the appetizer. Wondering who's going to call your name. That's the dessert. Who's in charge and who's this and who's that and who you like and who you don't like and who's doing this and who's doing that. Listen, child of God, that doesn't matter because oftentimes you can be so busy looking at stuff around Jesus and miss Jesus. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, don't waste your time
looking around and miss Jesus. Don't you waste your time worried about because the choir didn't sing the song that you like, that you missed the message that God was trying to give you. Don't you get caught up on the vessel who's communicating the word because you have a personality conflict with them that you miss God's word for your life. We have to desire God above everything. A.W. Tozer said, if we have no desire, we may be dead. Only a dead body feels no hunger. And maybe there are too many dead Christians walking. Dead souls have no desire. Hunger and thirst are signs of life for the believer. Let me see if I can push it right here. I ain't messed up about the person who was out all night last night that stumbles in church this morning with the residue of yesterday's refreshments on them, because at least that they showed up this morning, it lets me know that they're hungry. I'm not messed up about the girl who has a checkered past and you know all her business and you don't like what she has on because it's too short or it's too tight according to your liking. But I ain't messed up about that. The fact that she made it to 1821 Edmund Street at 11:15, it's a sign that she's hungry. I'm not upset about the mama who comes in with a bad attitude because she struggled to get her and her babies together. And I don't know what she had to fight through at her house, but she comes in here and snatches her children and throws her bag on the pew. I ain't upset about that. She's here because she's thirsty and hungry. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, you don't know what I've been through, but I came in struggling. I came in fumbling. I came in crying because I'm thirsty. Woo. We hunger and thirst for righteousness. Oh, I want to push this today. Righteousness is more than halo holiness. Righteousness is more than outward symptoms of piety. Because oftentimes we think if we got it right on the outside, we got it right on the inside. No, righteousness is the desire to be right with God and have rightness with others. I want to shepherd you, need hope. Righteousness, you can't be right with God and don't get along with nobody. Righteousness is not that long as I got King Jesus, I don't need nobody else. No, righteousness says I'm right with God. And because I'm right with God, sometimes it takes a little energy for me to get right with my brother, but it's worth the energy. Look at your neighbor and say it's worth the energy. This idea of righteousness permeates the book of Matthew. It's to do the will of God on several levels, personally, morally, and socially. To be righteous is to have connection with God and be sensitive about what's going on with your brothers and sisters. Listen, you just can't be satisfied as long as your marriage is all right. Do you have a burden for other people's marriage? You just can't be okay with what's going on with you. You have to have a sensitivity. And this is the thing, it's easy for us to have an appetite for personal piety and have an absence of care for others. The cross reminds us of holistic righteousness. I practice righteousness when I look at the cross. I reach up to God intentionally or daily, and I extend my hand to others intentionally. I'll say it again. I practice righteousness by desiring God daily and extending my hand to others intentionally. Listen, that's the problem. White, right-wing religion will push righteousness as only an upward relationship with God. But yet they will remain segregated. They will go to Sunday school and cut funding for urban schools. I'll push it further. We have a nation that declares righteousness. Yet they will pick on smaller nations, cut funding for social programs, for minorities, for those who desperately need it just to survive. And I ain't talking about people across the street or across town. I'm talking about people right here in Glenview and McAllen area. They will cut programs and after-school programs for kids who need some place to go. And then they will declare that they are Christian and on the Lord's side and stand on the nation's capital and say, God bless America. Ain't nothing holy or right about that. Your children have hand-me-down books, but when they go to their side of town, they got the best of books. That ain't righteousness. And then they're trying to tell you and how to legislate you to what to do with your body. Too often, churches, we talk about righteousness, but we spend all of our time talking about what we want, how worship ought to be, how we feel about what's going on. And it's always convenient, and it never moves beyond the sanctuary, so we don't ever gain any street credit for being responsive to the needs of those who are outside of the church. Is something wrong with that? This thirsting and hungering after righteousness is in the present tense. Let the church say the present tense. It reminds us it's an ongoing action. I came to tell somebody this. Just because you see God and hear God one time doesn't mean that you don't need to go back. It's a daily exercise. We never graduate or we never grow beyond pursuing God. As the deer pants for the water, the deer comes to the stream one day, but the deer comes back again. Finally, Jesus assures us when we desire what is good, when we desire what is proper, and most importantly, God approved, satisfaction is inevitable. Listen, church, I came to tell you, God fills us when we pursue him. We must be clear, your feeling cannot come from your hand. You need the hand of another. Listen, satisfaction cannot come from your hand. You need the hand of a loving, caring, and sensitive God. Many of us have tried to satisfy ourselves with friends, and friends have left you disappointed. Somebody, you tried to quench your thirst with power, and it only left you depleted. Some of us have tasted the sourness of short-lived success. We've desired unhealthy relationships, and it left us bitter. Can I tell you something, church? Life has a way of leaving you hungry, thirsty, starving, and sour. But I came to tell somebody, if you learn how to pursue God, you'll have the testimony of Psalm 34:8. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, I've had a whole lot of stuff that left me wanting. But somebody can testify when you hold on to God. God has a way of leaving you satisfied. And I'm done when I tell you this. Every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before. And the more you walk with him, you'll love him more and more to the glory of God.